In the Rose Garden at Hyde Park, beside the grave of her husband, the 32nd President of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt was buried. She was 78 years old. Mrs. Roosevelt's children are there. James, Elliot, John, Anna, Franklin Jr. The President is there, the Presidents, Kennedy with Mrs. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, then Vice President, Truman, Eisenhower, Ambassador Adlai Stevenson. It was not her life, as her friend Adlai Stevenson put it, that the world had lost. She had lived that out to the full. What we have lost, he said, what we have to recall for ourselves, to remember, is what she was herself, and who can name it? Who can name it? There are fairy tales in all the tongues of the world about children who live under the spell of sleep in a magic prison surrounded by thickets and thorns, a prison from which they are one day awakened by a touch to turn into shining figures of life. No one knows how they become what they are at the end, only that they are. What Eleanor Roosevelt remembered, looking back, was an unhappy little girl in a lost family in a vanished world. A child she never could have been, but was. She said, too, that her mother was always a little troubled by her lack of beauty, and that she knew it as a child senses those things. And that her pretty young aunts, her mother's sisters, told her so in so many words.
One of the aunts was to say to me, "You are the ugly duckling of the family." It was an unknown thing for a whole girl not to be a belle at every party.
And it was, too. They were a pretty lot, her aunts and her mother. Above all, her mother, whose clothes she loved to stroke. But her mother preferred her little brothers and showed it, and called her Granny, because Eleanor was so old-fashioned. With her father, however, things were different. He called her Little Nell, and she adored him. But her relationship with her father was brief. He began drinking when she was quite small, and eventually he was sent off to a little town in Virginia. Eleanor never knew why, only that she loved him, and he was gone.
My darling little Nell, because Father is not with you is not because he doesn't love you. For I love you tenderly and dearly, And maybe soon I'll come back well and strong, and we will have such good times together, like we used to have.
When she was 8, her mother died almost overnight. Diphtheria went very fast in those days. And her brother Elliot also died of diphtheria. And Eleanor and her baby brother went to live with her grandmother Hall on 37th Street, and in the summers at Tivoli on the Hudson. I remember the 37th Street home as the darkest, most desolate house I have ever seen. And Tivoli, too, was grim and lonely.
I was 6 years older than my youngest brother. And in the country, there were no children my age at all. And we went there for practically 5 months every year.
There were no children her age to play with. And later, when her Uncle Valley began drinking, none were allowed. No one who did not know the family well enough to understand. One day, Eleanor said to my mother, "Auntie, I have no real home," and burst into tears. And then, when she was not quite 10, her father died as the result of a riding accident, and she was really alone. Alone with her grandmother Hall, who had been a Miss Ludlow and a great belle in her youth, and who lived all her life as though the entire world was society.
To my family, this society was all important. There didn't exist anything that was as important as this small, closed-in society, largely at that time presided over by Mrs. Astor and looked upon by those who really thought it important as practically the only people who existed.
Eleanor belonged to that world, of course, and she knew its customs. But though she belonged, she was never a part of it. Her sadness and loneliness set her off. And yet, for the rest of us, it was a lovely world to be young in, to go dancing in, to do all the things which seemed simpler and surer and pleasanter than they ever could have been in any other time or place.
My grandmother was convinced that the world she had grown up in was the world that was going to always exist. It was never suggested to me that the world was going to be different.
It had its obligations, too. Obligations which were particularly strong in Eleanor's family and mine.
I had this horrible sense of obligation, which was bred in me. I couldn't help it.
Eleanor's and my grandfather had founded the Newsboys Club, now called the Children's Aid Society. And when we were quite small, we used to be taken there to help serve Christmas dinner. Her horrible sense of obligation and a deep and isolating sense of loneliness, of life in a dream, made life difficult for Eleanor. After her father's death, Eleanor was seldom allowed to visit her Roosevelt relatives, and when we did see her at Uncle Ted's, she felt at a great disadvantage, because she was not used to companions her own age. And her education, too, had been neglected. When she was 6, her great-aunt Ludlow discovered to her horror that Eleanor couldn't read.
My grandmother felt that she was doing the best she knew how. She was sending me to the most fashionable little class, conducted by a pompous old gentleman named Mr. Rosa.
That wasn't the whole of her childhood education, of course.
I had learned French before I learned English from a French nurse, who was bad for my character but good for my language.
Finally, when she was 15, it was decided to send her to a French school in England, which our Auntie Bai had attended when it was at Versailles before the Franco-Prussian War. Its headmistress, Mademoiselle Souvestre, was a remarkable woman with strong ideas of her own. She thought that the verdict in the Dreyfus case was outrageous, as of course it was, and that the British were to blame in the Boer War. And all this she used to say in the most fearless manner and to the lively interest of all of us. The years at school with Mademoiselle Souvestre must have been like the opening of a window in Eleanor's life. When she came back at the end of her 3 years, it was to return to Tivoli, where Uncle Valley was worse and her grandmother almost entirely preoccupied with her fears of what he might do. Tivoli, that summer, was a grim, closed, miserable world of its own. Not a very good preparation for being a gay and joyous debutante. Coming out in New York at the turn of the century was something of an ordeal for anyone. For Eleanor, it was a nightmare. That first winter, she said, when my sole object in life was society, nearly brought me to a state of nervous collapse. She was a stranger in her own world. There was absolutely nothing about me, she said, to attract anybody's attention. She was wrong, of course, and it was about this time she began seeing something of her cousin Franklin, 5th cousin once removed. Many of Eleanor's friends thought she was too good for him. All they could see in Franklin Roosevelt was a handsome Harvard boy, whereas she, with her unflinching honesty and total lack of self-pity, touched their hearts. But then, of course, he felt the same way. He had somehow the maturity and insight to recognize Eleanor for what she was under all that surface awkwardness and embarrassment. And in the fall of 1903, when she was 19 and he 21, he asked her to marry him. It seemed, she said, an entirely natural thing, the sort of thing you did. But she also said long afterward, it was years before she understood what being in love was or what loving really meant. As for Franklin, he too had his difficulties. He had his widowed mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, a formidable and in many ways a remarkable woman.
Dearest Mama, I know what pain I must have caused you, and you know I wouldn't do it if I really could have helped it. You know that nothing can ever change what we have always been and always will be to each other. Only now you have 2 children to love and to love you. And Eleanor, as you know, will always be a daughter to you in every true way. Your ever-loving FDR.
The wedding was set for March 17th, 1905, to allow Uncle Ted, now President-elect Theodore Roosevelt, to give Eleanor away. Franklin and Eleanor were married in the Ludlow house at 80 75th Street by the Reverend Endicott Peabody. It was a most exciting affair, with the bridesmaids, I was one, in cream taffeta. But when the reception began, the bride and groom found themselves deserted. Uncle Ted had gone into the library where the refreshments were, and the wedding guests had followed the president in a body. Finally, Eleanor and Franklin followed too. Eleanor thought of herself in those years as a curious mixture of extreme innocence and unworldliness, with a great deal of knowledge of some of the less attractive and less agreeable sides of life. I had painfully high ideals, she said, and a tremendous sense of duty, entirely unrelieved by any sense of humor or any appreciation of the weaknesses of human nature.
The young Roosevelts took their honeymoon in Europe. London, where they were mistaken for the Theodore Roosevelts and given the royal suite in Brown's Hotel. Paris, where Franklin bought books on the quay. Then a motor trip through France with the customary hazards of the time. And on to northern Italy and Venice, where they spent most of the hot nights in a gondola on the canals, and Franklin refused to look at any more churches. Cortina, and up through the Alps to St. Moritz, England again, Scotland, and so home to a little house on East 36th Street, 3 blocks from Franklin's mother's house, which she had rented for them and furnished and provided with servants. Eleanor was beginning, she said, to be an entirely dependent person, driving with her mother-in-law every afternoon, taking at least one meal with her every day, and generally doing whatever she was told. It was a pleasant enough time in her life. Some of the shyness wore off. And she began, as she put it, to fit into this pattern of a fairly conventional, quiet, young society matron. That was the pattern she continued to fit into for the next 10 years and more. She was a dutiful wife, a docile daughter-in-law, and a constant mother, bearing child after child, living in houses her mother-in-law owned or built or rented, in cities her husband's law practice or political activities or government service took him to, New York, Albany, Washington. When Franklin became Assistant Secretary of the Navy in Woodrow Wilson's cabinet in 1913, She accepted what she called the slavery of the Washington social system without question. Her job, Eleanor insisted, was to do exactly as the majority of women were doing, perhaps to be a little more meticulous about it, and she was. If the story of Eleanor Roosevelt had ended in 1917, there would have been little enough to remember. A lonely and dutiful little girl, a self-effacing young wife, a frequent mother, a conventional woman of her place and time, who nevertheless was not a part of her place and time. A shy and lonely ghost wandering under the trees of a Hyde Park she could never think of, she said, as home. But the story did not end in 1917. It began then.
By 1917, that world of Eleanor's grandmother, that world that was always going to exist, had stopped existing, stopped in a welter of meaningless death and idiot destruction in the old Europe out of which it had come. The hidden flaw in the structure of modern history was cracking open in one country after another around the world, and nothing would ever be the same again. Men died, millions of them, who had barely begun to live. And men began to live, and women too, who had no lives before. Eleanor Roosevelt was one.
I went into the canteen, which served in the railroad yard, and I suddenly began to understand what some of the conditions were in our country. We were sending men to fight who had no idea where they were going nor why.
The small, closed world, which had once been all the world Eleanor knew, was coming down, and she was face to face with something she had never guessed or dared to guess before. Not the realization that the world outside was a tragic world. She had always known that. She had learned that by suffering herself. Rather, the sudden perception that there was something she could do about it. She herself, Eleanor Roosevelt, dutiful and obedient child and girl and woman. One can almost name the day of that realization. She had driven over to St. Elizabeth, the federal insane asylum, where her husband's department, the Navy, had taken over a block of buildings for shell-shocked sailors and Marines. What she saw as she drove through the grounds horrified her. Poor, demented creatures, she said, with apparently very little attention being paid them, gazing from behind bars or walking up and down on enclosed porches. Before the war, she would have kept her horror to herself, acquiescing in the world the way it was. Now she acted. She went to the Secretary of the Interior, whose department was responsible for St. Elizabeth's, told him he had better go over and see for himself. Kept after him until he had persuaded the Congress to increase the hospital's appropriations. Got a charitable organization to contribute $500 for occupational therapy. Hounded the Red Cross to build a recreation room. A new force had appeared in the world, although the world would not know it for some years to come. A woman who accepted personal responsibility for her country and her time. A citizen who took self-government personally and seriously and would not rest until she had done what she felt she had to do. She had learned a lesson she put for herself in 9 words. What one has to do usually can be done, meaning that what her conscience demanded of her, she would henceforth somehow accomplish.
There was another lesson that went with it. Hope is not enough. In the fall of 1918, the Great War, the World War, ended in the brightest moment of hope in modern times. The hope for an end of war, for a parliament of mankind, a League of Nations. It was a hope that came out of America in the proposal of an American president, and the people of Europe went mad with joy. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was in Europe with her husband, was a witness of that hope. Returning home on the same ship as Woodrow Wilson, she was also a witness to his campaign across the United States on behalf of the League. And to the maneuvers of the enemies of the League of Nations, headed by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. And to the final tragedy, the death of the hope and the death of a man. Nothing was left of all that suffering and aspiration but the grave of the unknown soldier in Arlington Cemetery. That and the graves of all the others around the world. America returned to what Warren Harding, the Republican candidate for the presidency in 1920, called normalcy, and Eleanor watched it go. Her husband was the Democratic candidate for the vice presidency, and Eleanor saw the whole campaign beginning with Franklin's notification at Hyde Park. She watched her husband and his running mate, James Cox, through the long weeks of train trips and speeches and parades until their final defeat in November. Normalcy for the young Roosevelts meant a return to domesticity, to the practice of the law, and to what Eleanor called a winter with nothing but teas, luncheons, and dinners to take up time. An impossible mode of living after the realities of the war. Eleanor Roosevelt and her husband were caught with the rest of that generation in a dead eddy of time like the suck of a bathtub running out. the circling, directionless eddy we call the 20s, a time when time existed to be spent, lost, forgotten.
Except that Eleanor Roosevelt never wasted anything, least of all time. She learned to write shorthand, to cook, to type, and a winter passed, and a spring. And suddenly for Eleanor Roosevelt and her husband, even that meaningless clock had stopped. One day he was sailing his boat at Campobello, swimming in the Bay of Fundy, a tall man, handsome, vigorous as all the Roosevelts were vigorous. And the next, he was a helpless cripple, paralyzed, his legs useless. He was not yet 40, and he would never move again without awkwardness and difficulty and pain. His life, his political, public life was over. His mother knew that. He would return to Hyde Park as the invalid he was and live there. But there was one man who didn't know it, Louis Howe, the little newspaper man from Albany. And there was a woman who didn't know it either, Eleanor, his wife. Why? You can answer for Louis Howe. He was a superb politician, a kingmaker, and he knew a king when he saw one. You can answer for Louis Howe, but why did Eleanor Roosevelt agree with him? Fight her mother-in-law for her husband's soul. Struggle through the most trying winter, as she called it, of her entire life. She knew it was kinder, gentler to that suffering and uncomplaining husband of hers to let him be, as his mother wanted to let him be, as most wives would have wanted to let him be. She knew that pain and disappointment and public humiliation might well lie ahead, and yet she persisted, staked her womanhood on it, her husband's affection, her mother-in-law's goodwill, her family's happiness. Why? Because she had learned that what one has to do usually can be done. Because she felt there was something her husband had to do. All we know for certain is that she won her fight. Eleanor Roosevelt entered politics herself, first through the Women's Trade Union League, and then as a member of the Women's Division of the Democratic State Committee, to draw her husband's interest back to the political world.
By 1924, Franklin Roosevelt had made the difficult return. At the Democratic National Convention, he nominated Al Smith for the presidency, likening him to the happy warrior. But to those who listened, the happy warrior was the broken man with a confident, smiling face who stood there, balanced precariously on his crutches, taking up his life again. The great gamble had paid off. Franklin Roosevelt was back in the world again, so firmly back that 4 years later, the state convention of his party nominated him for the governorship of New York. Back so effectively that when the Democratic National ticket lost New York in 1928, he carried it. The two Roosevelts, Franklin and Eleanor, had the future in their hands. Looking around her from that triumphant moment, Eleanor Roosevelt could see what before she could only have guessed. There was indeed something to be done. Hitler was on the rise in Germany. Corruption in the Harding cabinet had shaken the faith of Americans in their government. And the 8 years of stock market profits that had paid for the dizzy dance of the 20s were about at an end. The market crashed, and the world came crumbling down into the Great Depression that the war had dug for it. It was the pit at the world's end, or at the end at least of one world. Bread lines appeared in every city. Self-respecting men with shame on their faces sold pencils and apples in the streets, and their children went hungry. Eleanor Roosevelt reacted as she always had to human suffering, personally. She gave her card to the miserable in Times Square, invited the hungry to her own table. But it wasn't that kind of misery. Before Hoover's term was out, veterans of the World War marched on Washington to demand the immediate payment of a bonus. They were met by Smedley Butler, a famous general of Marines.
It's an honor, a privilege to come here and be with you. I mean just what I say. I don't want anything. Nobody can kick me anymore. I'll say what I say. You have just as much right to have a lobby here as any steel corporation. Listen, don't make any mistake about it. You've got the sympathy of the American people. Now, don't you lose it. We've got a God-given form of government, and whether it's run right or not depends on the people who do the voting.
But words, even the homely words of General Butler, were no answer to a hungry stomach. Eventually, the bonus marchers, as were called, were driven out of Washington by General MacArthur, acting under President Hoover's orders. By now, it was obvious to others than Eleanor Roosevelt that there were things to be done. Only what? And by whom? The election of 1932 answered the second half of that question. A tall man, his legs braced in a metal contraption, his face confident among frightened faces, arrived at the White House in March of 1933. He drove up Pennsylvania Avenue with the outgoing president, Herbert Hoover, beside him. Took the oath of office on the Capitol steps and said,
"First of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Our greatest primary task is to put people to work. This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly. Nor need we shrink from honestly facing conditions in our country today. This nation is asking for action, and action now."
But what type of action? The first half of the question remained. What should be done? What could be done? The wreckage in the Great Republic was human wreckage. People had been hurt, frightened, bewildered. How did you deal with people? The new economists in the White House had their theories. Eleanor Roosevelt had hers. Only hers were never theories, but actions. On the 15th of May, she drove down to the Anacostia Flats in her own car to talk to a new group of bonus marchers. that year, as the Depression deepened and the winter came on, she began to speak her own mind in her own way.
The needs are going to be great this coming winter. There will be, I hope, more people employed. But those who are not employed will need more than they have needed before. Their clothes have completely gone. Their courage is not as high as it was a year ago. So there is no reason for letting up in our sense of responsibility.
Certainly, she never let up. She went everywhere misery was to be found, and that was everywhere in those days. Everywhere misery could be found, and everywhere misery could be fought. Up in the air on the sling of one of the great cranes building dams for the Tennessee Valley Authority. Down to earth in one of the rural slums where the resettlement administration was building hospitals, teaching skills, feeding children. Underground in West Virginia or Pennsylvania or Illinois, where the mines were dying and men were out of work and the equipment was idle. Until she became an American legend of ubiquity, of ceaseless movement, running, flying, dancing. An American myth of measureless energy, an inexhaustible theme for wisecracks. Some of them, like Jack Benny's, kind.
I'm very happy to buy this ticket from you, Mr. Benny, and how much do I owe you?
Well, that's 25 cents for the one ticket, honey.
Can you give me change for $1?
For a dollar? Well, I haven't the change with me just now, but I'll be glad to send it to you if you'll just stay in one place.
Until she became something more, a center of controversy. The kind of controversy that conscience in action, personal conscience in personal action, always provokes.
Mrs. Roosevelt, you are the first lady of the land who has ever appeared before a congressional committee. I can assure you that we are deeply appreciative of your presence.
Mrs. Roosevelt, would you please tell the committee about the conditions as you found them on your visits to the various welfare institutions?
I came away with the feeling that if in the United States Blue Plains was our conception of how to care for the aged, we were at a pretty low ebb of civilization. It was a sick feeling you got from the whole atmosphere.
Her own kind, her own class, as they called themselves, found it difficult to forgive talk as honest as that. Anyone who saw unpleasant things and mentioned them was palpably an enemy of the established order. And journalists of a certain stripe agreed, with the result that the president's wife became the target of column after column of almost daily vituperation. Some patriotic organizations disapproved, and one, the Daughters of the American Revolution, expressed its dissent from her well-known views on racial discrimination by refusing the use of its Washington auditorium to one of the finest of American singers because she sang in a dark skin. Marian Anderson, needless to say, was not embarrassed by the refusal. She appeared instead at the Lincoln Memorial as a guest of the government of the United States. And Eleanor Roosevelt was not embarrassed.
I hear the train a-comin', she's comin' round the curve. She's loosened all the steam and brakes and straining every nerve. And get on board, little children, get on board. Little children, get on board. Little children, there's room for many more.
But the president was concerned as the abuse became uglier, and eventually he put his wife's detractors in their proper places.
These Republican leaders have not been content with attacks on me, or on my wife, or on my sons. No, not content with that. They now include my little dog, Falla. Well, of course, I don't resent attacks, and my family don't resent attacks, but Falla does resent it.
Curiously enough, I never minded criticism much. I think I learned very young to know that everything passes. And if you just live it through, it comes to an end. If there is criticism and there is a foundation of right in it, well then, it's fair criticism and you have to take it. If there is no foundation in it, well, sooner or later, people are going to find it out. And in the meantime, it doesn't really matter much. The only thing I would mind would be if it really affected the people I love, people whose feeling of affection it really disturbed.
And of course, it never did affect the people she loved. People were everything to her, not only her own people, but all the others everywhere. And it is largely for this reason that her understanding of her own time, of the tragic and violent events that made up her own time, seems sounder in retrospect than the understanding of many of her husband's best informed advisors. They thought in terms of policies. She thought in terms of people. Hitler, to her, was not a new political leader who might or might not change the balance of power in Europe. He was a perverter of humanity, including the humanity of the German people and particularly of the German young. Franco was not a general who had checked Russian ambitions in Spain. He was a fascist who had overthrown the first hopeful Republican government Spain had ever had and turned the country back into a police state from which thousands of Spaniards escaped as best they could. It is for this reason, too, that she understood long before the majority of the American people that fascism and Nazism were dangers not only in Europe, but to our own continent and republic as well. The real question she saw was the human question. The issue everywhere, Russia, Germany, Italy, Spain, was the issue of human decency, human freedom. And the ultimate outcome would depend on human choice, particularly the choice and decision of the young. Feeling as she did, Eleanor Roosevelt could hardly help expressing her feelings, president's wife or not.
All of us have an equal responsibility in the one great country that is free to the rest of the world, wherever there may be people who are not free, to become free again.
And the dictatorships replied in kind. Goebbels called her a figure of fun, a silly woman talking of things that should be reserved for politicians. Mussolini attacked her as a nuisance who should be embargoed, and Franco added his bitter word from behind the skirts of his defenders. None of this, needless to say, interested Eleanor Roosevelt. She was not concerned with what Nazis and communists thought of her, only with what her fellow countrymen thought of Nazism and communism. Democracy was on trial even in the United States, where voices were already arguing for a change in American purposes toward the left or toward the right.
In the name of patriotism, which loved America to carry it on to victory, I ask you if you will rise in your places and pledge with me to restore America to the Americans.
What mattered to Mrs. Roosevelt was not the speakers, but the response, above all, the response of the young. If young Americans decided, as some already had, that authoritarianism was the wave of the future, then freedom and self-government in America would also disappear. The young generation of those years had grown up in the universal disillusionment after the World War. They believed the generation before them had been had by the imperialists of Germany and England and France. They were determined not to be had themselves. They were persuaded, many of them, that the way not to be had was to support the Russian Revolution, which had rejected the World War in 1917, to become communists or to follow the Communist Party line. Most of their elders in the 30s reacted by denunciations and threats. Young communists were criminals who should be hounded by congressional committees, such as that headed by Congressman Martin Dies, and exposed, excommunicated, if possible, deported. Not so Mrs. Roosevelt. She could understand perfectly well why young people might call themselves communists in the conditions of the 30s. But she understood also how little chance communism had to hold the allegiance of the young if the young had a free chance to decide for themselves. For this reason, and despite considerable criticism, Mrs. Roosevelt had extended her hospitality and her friendship to a number of leftward-looking youth organizations, and even at a time when she herself was under attack in the communist press. In the winter of 1939-40, the American Youth Congress, largest and most vocal of these groups, held a meeting in Washington and invited Mrs. Roosevelt to speak. By that time, the issue between the young leftists and American opinion in general was sharply drawn. The Nazi-Soviet pact had been signed 6 months earlier, and World War II had already begun with the German invasion of Poland. When the Soviet Union attacked Finland, the sympathy of most Americans, Eleanor Roosevelt included, was with the Finns, while the Youth Congress followed the Russian line in calling Finland the aggressor. But despite these differences, Mrs. Roosevelt agreed to attend their meeting and answer their questions. Her husband, at her request, had addressed the delegates first, 4,500 of them standing in the rain in the White House garden, while the president characterized their views on the Finnish war as unadulterated twaddle.
It has been said that some of you are communists. That is a very unpopular term today. As Americans, you have a right, a legal and constitutional right, to call yourselves communists, those of you who do. You have a right, peacefully and openly, to advocate certain ideals of theoretical communism. But as Americans, you have not only a right but a sacred duty to confine your advocacy of changes in law to the methods prescribed by the Constitution of the United States. And you have no American right, by act or deed of any kind, to subvert the government and the Constitution of this nation.
By the time Mrs. Roosevelt's turn finally came, the atmosphere was sullen and hostile. But she gave candid, uncompromising, and courteous answers to loaded and often insulting questions.
I agree with you in your sympathy for Spain. I agree with you in your sympathy for China and Czechoslovakia. But I also have sympathy for Finland.
And when Mrs. Roosevelt walked out, she went to a standing ovation. The sight of an honest woman, respectful of the right of her listeners to differ, but loyal also to her own beliefs, was a reminder of the strength and decency of the democratic tradition, which shook all but the most doctrinaire. It was a memorable occasion, and a few months later, Mrs. Roosevelt's audience began to recollect it with a vivid comprehension. War was no longer something to debate. War existed. England evacuated Dunkirk in the spring of 1940. France fell, and the writing was on the wall.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Hostilities exist. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger.
Guam fell on the 13th, Wake on the 20th. The great British battleships, Prince of Wales and Repulse, were sunk by Japanese aircraft off the Malay coast. Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day. 8 days later, Manila fell, and the Americans in the Philippines were cut off on the Bataan Peninsula. The British lost an army at Singapore, and naval units of Great Britain, the Netherlands, and the United States were beaten in the Battle of the Java Sea. Every news bulletin was a new disaster. Six months after Pearl Harbor, the Nazis were 70 miles from Alexandria in Egypt and had taken Sevastopol on the Black Sea and invested Stalingrad. While Britain, starved by Nazi submarines and bombed by Nazi planes, was quite literally fighting for its life.
To most Americans in those terrible months, the one task was the prosecution of the war, the one end and aim, the survival of the country. But not to Eleanor Roosevelt. Not even the greatest cataclysm in history could quiet her conscience. What mattered to her was not survival only, but the things that survived. When she discovered that the Japanese Americans of California and the coast had been herded into American concentration camps in the panic that followed Pearl Harbor, she protested. For one thing, the whole idea of the concentration camps was abhorrent to a free society. For another, there was no proof, and history bore her out, that Japanese Americans were less loyal than other Americans. There could hardly have been a more unpopular cause in that place and time, but she fought it out, and by fighting it helped to fix her countrymen's attention on the real cause for which they were engaged, the cause of human decency and self-respect. This, throughout the war, was her continuing mission, to keep the human perspective, and she traveled the country from one end to the other to serve it.
In the fall of 1942, American troops in England were about to leave, though she didn't know it at the time, for the North African invasion. The president wanted her to visit the camps, so she flew the Atlantic in a commercial amphibian at her own expense, froze in the cold austerity of Buckingham Palace, went from American camp to American camp, talked to British women.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very grateful for the welcome which you have extended, and very grateful for the opportunity to learn, which is my real reason for coming to this country. I apologize to all of you whom I have made stand in the rain this morning. I think it must have been a very disagreeable experience. But having spent 3 years at school in England, I know that it's not an unusual one.
A year later, she crossed the Pacific. Traveled 25,000 miles through 17 Pacific islands. Visited hospitals and bases, recreation centers and nurses' homes. Ate breakfast with enlisted men at unlikely hours. Lost 30 pounds. Talked to enormous audiences, and came home tireder than she had ever been in her life, to tell anyone who would listen of the feel of her experience, the horrible consciousness of waste which the hospitals left with her, to try to prepare the families of wounded boys for their return. It used to be said at that time that Eleanor Roosevelt was her husband's eyes and ears, but it was never as simple as all that. For one thing, she was her husband's wife and had to take the consequences, as she discovered in New Zealand when she told a story she had picked up in her travels.
Just as the Marines were ordered to leave Guadalcanal, an officer found a private feeling very sad, looking very depressed. And he said, "What's the matter with you?" And he said, "Oh, I just can't go home. I haven't shot a Jap." And so the officer said, "Well, listen, I'll tell you what to do. You go up to that ridge over there and jump up all of a sudden and say, 'The hell with Hirohito.' And they'll jump up other people all around, and if you shoot first, you'll get a Jap." So he came by a little while later, and the Marine was still looking very gloomy, and he said, "Did you do what I told you to do?" And he said, "Yes, sir, yes. I ran up there, and I did just what you told me to do, and I said, 'To hell with Hirohito,' and they jumped up just as you told me they would, but they all shouted, 'To hell with Roosevelt.'"
"20 months later, her husband died at Warm Springs in Georgia. When the news came, she flew south at once, returning in the train with the president's body. All through the April night, she kept the window shade open beside her berth so that she could see the faces of the crowds in the dimly lighted stations and at the country crossroads. She thought, she said, about the ballad of the lonely train that carried Lincoln's body to Springfield. And when morning came, and the caisson with its flag-covered coffin had come down between silent, weeping crowds from the Union Station in Washington to the White House, she was waiting. She walked slowly down the steps beneath the portico and touched the flag. And she was waiting, too, at the funeral in the East Room of the White House. It seemed to her, she said, that everyone in the world was there except 3 of my own sons, 2 of them sailors, 1 a soldier. And afterwards, as the great of the world came to leave their wreaths on the grave of the dead president, she was still waiting, looking forward, looking back. She said once that Franklin Roosevelt might have been happier with a wife who was completely uncritical, but she said, too, "I think I sometimes acted as a spur, even though the spurring was not always wanted or welcome." I was one of those, she said, who served his purposes. But she was also one of those who gave his purposes their meaning and their words. On the 6th of June in 1944, when the whole mind of the Republic was fixed on the beaches of Normandy, Eleanor Roosevelt spoke to the women of her own country and beyond them to the women of the world. Every woman, she said, will be praying that the victory may be speedy and that this time the sacrifices, whatever they are, will bring results which will justify in the eyes of those who fight whatever they have gone through. And then she added, it is not enough to win the fight. We must win that for which we fight. The triumph of all people who believe that the people of this world are worthy of freedom. One can see, of course, what she was remembering. Her mind had gone back 25 years. This time, the victory must be worthy of the suffering which bought it. This time, we must win not only the fight, but that for which we fight. This time, we must remember our purposes, our cause, not only in the hour of anguish, but in the hour of happiness when the troops return. All this was in her mind when she looked back from her husband's death a few months before the war had ended. But when she looked the other way into the future, she saw nothing. She didn't matter anymore. What had mattered was the president, and he was dead, his work finished, the glory left behind him for the others. To the reporters who met her in the train shed of the Pennsylvania station when she returned to New York on her way to anonymity, she said, "The story is over."
But of course, the story wasn't over. In a sense, it had just begun. In the last 15 years of her life, Eleanor Roosevelt, who had been the remarkable wife of a great president, became herself. Became indeed more than herself, became something very close to the conscience of her generation. And not in her own country alone, but throughout the world. Something very close to the voice of a common humanity which had had no voice before. It all began when President Truman appointed her 8 months after her husband's death to the American delegation to the organizational meeting of the General Assembly of the United Nations, to be convened in London in January of '46. No one, including Eleanor Roosevelt, was enthusiastic about the appointment. She thought she was not qualified, an opinion that the rest of the delegation, particularly the Republicans Dulles and Vandenberg, warmly endorsed. Mr. Truman, however, insisted, and the event proved him right. Assigned by her colleagues to Committee 3, which was to deal with humanitarian and social and cultural matters, and where obviously she could do the least harm, she soon found herself at the center of the hottest fight of the session, the fight over the Russian demand that all refugees be forced to return to their own countries, regardless of what their countries had become in the interim, as, for example, communist satellites. Ultimately, the debate reached the floor of the Assembly, where Andrei Vyshinsky, head of the Russian delegation and the most formidable advocate in the Assembly, presented the Soviet case. Who was to represent the United States? Her fellow delegates, not eager themselves for the dangerous honor, appealed to their unqualified colleague.
Now let's take paragraphs that they want to have added to this report. I gathered that Mr. Wyszynski felt that anyone who did not wish to return under the present forms of government must of necessity be fascist. I talked to a great many of these people. Their country, they feel, no longer belongs to them. They did not strike me as fascists. On this point, I'm afraid we hold very different ideas. I hope...
And Eleanor Roosevelt scored a notable victory, carrying the Assembly with her against every one of the Soviet amendments. It was a victory won without triumph and without leaving bitterness behind. And by the end of the session, it was obvious to everyone in London, including the members of the American delegation itself, that the most effective American in the General Assembly was Eleanor Roosevelt. It was a personal effectiveness. During the debates in the UN over Palestine and the Arab-Israeli war, she learned that her country's policy and the policy of the UN was under attack in the State Department and the Department of Defense. And she felt compelled to tell the President that if the agreed policy were altered, she would have to express her feelings publicly, and would, of course, resign from the United States delegation before doing so. The attacks ceased. She was beginning to be treated, so her critics complained, like a sovereign power. And sometimes they seemed to be right. Certainly the press of the world treated her correspondence with Cardinal Spellman of New York on one famous occasion as though it had been an exchange of state papers. The Cardinal had taken exception to Mrs. Roosevelt's view on federal aid to parochial schools and had published an open letter charging her with discrimination unworthy of an American mother. She replied in a personal letter assuring the Cardinal that she had no sense of being an unworthy American mother. The final judgment, my dear Cardinal Spellman, of the worthiness of all human beings is in the hands of God. Her letter was published in full in the Times, and eventually, after the Cardinal had called at Hyde Park for tea, a joint statement was issued asserting Mrs. Roosevelt's intention of continuing to say what she believed and affirming the Cardinal's confidence in the American right of free speech, which not only permits but encourages differences of opinion. Eleanor Roosevelt's greatest talent, as the world came more and more to see, was her ability to reduce the quarrels of doctrine and dogma to human differences, which could be discussed in human terms. That she herself was not afraid was demonstrated in what has come to be called the McCarthy era, when the junior senator from Wisconsin had launched his inquisition into the opinions of his fellow citizens.
The day that I am afraid to sit down in a room with people that I do not know, because perhaps 5 years from now, someone will say, you sat in the room and 5 people were communists, you are a communist. That day will be a bad day. We must preserve the right to think and to differ in the United States.
To think and to differ. You could write a definition of America on that text, as well as the story of Eleanor Roosevelt's greatest achievement. It was because she believed, really believed, in the right of human beings to think and to differ, that she became, toward the end of her life, a symbol of the American aspiration, and therefore of the belief in humanity for which the American aspiration had always stood.
business on the agenda is the election of officers.
And it was because the world thought of her in these terms that she became chairman of the United Nations Commission appointed to draft a universal declaration of human rights. President Truman had named her as American representative, but it was the members of the commission themselves who elected her chairman.
And the point of order shall be immediately decided by the chairman in accordance with the rules of procedure. Alternate delegate for Chile.
Señora Presidente, para Chile y para mi delegación, el trabajo realizado ha sido eficiente porque se ha logrado lo máximo dentro de lo posible. Esperamos.
I recognize the delegate from the USSR.
Истории привели к созданию на территории Китая Китайской Народной Республики.
The delegate from Egypt.
Sous la forme de propositions concrètes.
I don't know how other people feel, but I always get a lift out of the fact that you can hear all the criticisms and still have faith that the majority of the people will be right. I think it's always a very encouraging thing, and one that we in the Human Rights Commission must have tremendous faith in, because that's really the way that human rights will come to be a reality. Only as the people really come to believe in human rights and want to live for human rights.
It was largely because of her chairmanship that the commission was able, after 2 years of exhausting debate, to agree on a draft. That draft was presented on December 10, 1948, to a meeting of the General Assembly under the presidency of Dr. Evatt of Australia.
We'll turn, therefore, to the first portion of this proclamation, or Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We turn to the articles. I have to take them in turn. Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. The General Assembly.
It was 3 o'clock in the morning. The room was half empty as the voting went on, clause by clause, until at last the draft had been approved.
And every organ of society shall strive by teaching and education to promote respect for these rights and freedoms. We reached the stage, gentlemen, in which by an enormous vote and without any direct opposition, this Assembly has adopted this very important declaration. It is the first occasion on which the organized community of nations has made a declaration of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and it has the authority of the body of opinion of the United Nations as a whole. And millions of people, men and women and children, all over the world, many miles from Paris and New York, will turn for hope and guidance and inspiration to this document. And it's particularly fitting that here tonight should be the person who's been the leader in this movement, assisted though she has been by many others, the person who has raised to even greater honor so great a name. I refer, of course, to Mrs. Roosevelt, the delegate of the United States.
The figure that emerges in those last full years is a figure without likeness in our history. The lonely little girl in the dark parlor on 37th Street who asked only to be left to her unhappiness had become a woman known by sight to millions of human beings and by repute to nearly all the world. A woman who stood for compassion and hope in every continent of the earth, for courage and for belief. A woman who met the great and the simple, both with the same simplicity, giving and taking what she had given and taken all her life, the sense of humanity, of human worth. She was still plain, if that is or ever was the right word for her candid, selfless face. But no one who looked at her now ever thought of her plainness, only of her eyes. She was old, but it was her youth you saw when you met her. She was a great lady, as everyone kept saying over and over, the first lady of the world. But what the world found in her was a woman. A warm, completely honest, fearless woman who had lived a woman's life, accepted a woman's responsibilities, and changed the history of her time.